Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 16th Peter M. Wege Lecture on Sustainability at the University of Michigan, which will be presented shortly by Bill McKibben. My name is Greg Keolian, and I'm professor at the New School for Environment and Sustainability and director of the Center for Sustainable Systems. This Peter M. Wege lecture series focuses on critical issues of sustainability and honors Peter Wege for his many contributions to the Center for Sustainable Systems, our school, and the University of Michigan. Since its beginning in 2001, this lecture series has covered a wide set of topics ranging from sustainable cities, transportation and climate change, to biomimicry, and an Earth Day reflections by the Dalai Lama. Getting a lot of echo. Are you hearing echo? Out of my control, but I could talk from here. Sound people, can you help me? All right. Our lecture series again returns to the critical subject of climate change, which has been addressed in past by our former dean, the CEO of BP, Vice President Al Gore, Jose Figueres, the former president of Costa Rica, and several other sustainability leaders. We wish to thank Peter Wege and the Wege Foundation for their endowment, which helped make this event possible. While Peter passed away several years ago, 3 years ago, his philosophy towards the environment continues to be carried out by the foundation that bears his name. We'd like to acknowledge Peter's daughter, Diana Wege, son Jonathan Wege, who's board chair, and his wife, Marissa Wege, and Mark Van Putten, the CEO of the Wege Foundation, for the tremendous support the foundation has provided over the years. Will you please stand to be recognized? Thank you. This lecture is being presented and sponsored by our center, our school, as well as the LS&A Bicentennial Theme Semester. Other sponsors are listed on the back panel of the program, but I'd like to highlight and recognize one group here. Let's thank Michigan and the Climate Crisis students, faculty, and other committee members that helped organize this lecture and other events held on campus this week. Will the committee please stand up and be recognized? Thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dean Jonathan Overpeck, who will introduce our speaker. Dean Overpeck, or Peck as he likes to be called, is the inaugural dean of SEAS, our new School for Environment and Sustainability, and he is a nationally and internationally recognized climate scientist who has had a long and distinguished career before joining us at this academic year. I encourage you to learn more about Dean Peck by coming to the SEAS opening ceremonies and his Samuel A. Graham Dean's lecture on October 25th. And now, Dean Peck.
Thanks, Greg. Thank you all for coming. This is a total honor for me. And a wonderful introduction. I also want to thank everyone on behalf of the new School for Environment and Sustainability and the University of Michigan. And of course, special thanks to all the students and colleagues who are working with our partners in the Center for Sustainable Systems. I would like to echo thanks to the Wege Foundation and family, Diana, Jonathan, Marissa, Mark, thank you. They're all here tonight, as we've seen, and they've been supporting what has clearly become the flagship lecture on sustainability at Michigan and in Michigan. Something probably is a flagship lecture series for universities across the nation. And special thanks to our campus partners of the Eisenberg Institute and the Bicentennial Office, among others. I'd also like to thank, again, the committee, faculty, students, and others who envisioned and organized the week-long and amazing, from my point of view, it's great for a climate scientist to show up and be able to participate in something like this, the week-long symposium on Michigan and the climate crisis, of which this lecture, the Wege lecture, is the keynote event. This climate symposium is the most comprehensive event of its kind since U of M's original teach-in on the environment in 1970. Then Michigan was setting the stage for Earth Day and all that came after that. And this time we're signaling that University of Michigan is stepping up in a whole new way to work with our partners on and across campus, as well as off of campus, to meet the many aspects of the growing climate crisis. As I've heard throughout the week, we are behind the curve, as we've all heard throughout the week. We're behind the curve when it comes to dealing with the climate challenge. Our options are running out, and I say this as a climate scientist. We no longer have decades to act. Now we have to get moving. And what we do in the coming years will set the course of this entire planet and future generation for centuries to come. It's my sincere hope that everyone here tonight will be moved to do even more, and indeed, to do everything in your power to fight climate change. We also hope that the events of this week will become will translate into a widespread personal commitment by the University of Michigan community to take individual and collective action on climate change. And who could be better to kick off this movement at the University of Michigan than Bill McKibben, whom the Boston Globe called probably, I'd say with an exclamation point, America's most important environmentalist. It's an honor to welcome Bill McKibben tonight as the 2017 Wege Lecturer on Sustainability. Not only is Bill McKibben a renowned environmentalist, he is a prolific author and journalist who has written extensively on the impact of global warming. He's the Schumann Distinguished Scholar at Middlebury College, and perhaps most famously, he is the leader of the global anti-carbon movement, 350.org. His first book, The End of Nature, published in 1989, served as an introduction for many of us here tonight on the very concept of climate change. Over the past decade, Bill McKibben's extraordinary ability to organize and mobilize has come to the fore. He founded 350.org in 2008, and in less than a decade since its founding, 350 has organized thousands of rallies around the world, I believe in every country save one, North Korea. When asked recently by commentator Bill Maher about the federal government stepping back on climate action, Bill said, "The silver lining is that people are fighting back." He should know, and I think he's right. Here at the University of Michigan, we are on the cusp of major change in how we engage society, starting with issues of environment sustainability. We're going to fight back on climate change. We believe that it is the role and obligation of universities, and this is shared all the way up to the president of this university, to help make the world a more sustainable and just place. in very real and tangible ways. We hope and fully intend over the coming months and years to move the needle meaningfully on sustainability and set a new example for other universities to follow, not just on climate change, but on all the issues confronting humanity across the planet. We have so much to learn from Bill McKibben, and we are thrilled for the opportunity to learn from him tonight. Perhaps the most thrilling part is to look out in this audience, that audience, and to see the mass of eager learners and activists, scholars and students alike, and to realize the dramatic potential for change that exists when we work together. Thank you for all being here tonight, and please join me in welcoming our guest of honor, Bill McKibben.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. It is a great pleasure, Dr. Overpeck, to get to say in person many thanks for your research and work over the years, which has been crucial, and to say thanks for inviting me here. I'm especially glad to be giving this Wege lecture, not only because of the Foundation's great philanthropic work over the years, but also because it turns out that the fortune that supports it derives from the steel case furniture business. Now, when I was a young man, my first job out of college was at the New Yorker magazine. And you know how it is when you first go to your very first job, and what fun it is to sort of close the door in your office and look over all your office supplies and things, and you see them all. And not only did I have a steel case chair, but even better, a nice round wastebasket that said steel case on it. Now, for the younger ones of you, we actually had, I mean, this is not a wastebasket on the corner of your screen to which you drag the things. This was one that you would sit and toss things, you know, and truthfully, I used the waste paper basket more than anything else in my office. It was a vital part of my operation. So for that and for very much else, many, many thanks. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, probably more a pleasure for me than for you. This is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful Michigan day. At the time of the year when we begin to count how many beautiful afternoons there might be left to stroll around. And yet, here you all have been dragged inside to listen to someone whose basic profession in the world is just bumming people out, you know? And for that, I apologize in advance, and I will try to get fairly quickly through the worst of it and end on a more hopeful note. But there is no point in, one has to talk frankly about the scale and the pace of the problem that we face in order to understand the scale and the pace of the solutions that are required. One has to be realistic about where we are. And where we are, well, we're going to walk through the valley of the shadow for a minute here because the news is not good. In fact, everything that we say this week is sort of in the shadow of what's going on with our countrymen in Puerto Rico and the kind of fear and sadness and loss and danger that people are now, millions of them, experiencing hour by hour that it's hard for us to quite comprehend. But there's a lot of that on this world now. We've increased the temperature of the planet roughly 1 degree Celsius, 1.7 or so degrees Fahrenheit. That doesn't sound like very much, but it turns out that it's a lot. You could express that heat in other units. The extra heat that we've trapped by burning coal and oil and gas and putting that carbon in the atmosphere. The extra heat is the heat equivalent of 400,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs a day, okay? And we know that it's a lot of heat because of what it's done. Now, when I wrote the first book about all this back in 1989, we didn't know how fast and how hard it was going to pinch. The story of the intervening 30 years is it's pinched a lot harder and a lot faster than we would have guessed. Look up at the Arctic. We've lost maybe half of the summer sea ice up there. Think about the heat required to do that, to melt a kind of continent-sized chunk of meters-thick, millennia-old ice. Think about the ocean as a whole, and we're, after all, an ocean planet. The extra carbon that we've put in the atmosphere, some of it's absorbed in the sea, and when it is absorbed, it changes the chemistry of the oceans, which are 30% more acidic than they were 40 years ago. That is a staggering change. The heat in the oceans and its changing chemistry are combining to do almost unbelievable damage to the things we don't see beneath the waves. I was in the Pacific with all our colleagues from 350 in the Pacific about a year ago, a little more, when the big waves of warm water associated with that record El Nino swept across the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, and in the course of a week or two managed to wipe out 50, 60, 80, 90, in some places 100% of the coral reefs that surround those islands and atolls and have forever. The Great Barrier Reef off Australia is the largest living structure on our planet, but it's only half as living as it was 18 months ago. Okay. We see the effects of that heat in the way that water moves around this planet in its hydrological cycles. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold. If you want one fact to understand the 21st century, that might be the one to pick. It means that in arid areas, we get much more evaporation that we're used to, and hence more drought. And we see those droughts kick in with the most devastating effects. It was the worst drought in the history of what we used to call the Fertile Crescent that seems to have been one of the triggers for the civil war in Syria that now has sent refugees streaming across the planet. It was the drought across the west and the north that has brought forest fires like we've never seen before to our continent. But once that water is evaporated up in the atmosphere, it's going to come down. I think the average residence time in the atmosphere for a molecule of water vapor is only about 7 days, I think. And when it comes down, therefore, it tends to come down in amounts and quantities that we have never seen before. When Hurricane Harvey last month came to Houston, it just obliterated the US record for the largest rainfall event ever. 54 inches of rain, 4.5 feet of rain fell on parts of Texas in the course of that storm. Some of those records were challenged when 10 days later, Hurricane Maria came over Puerto Rico. We don't have all the final data yet, and people are still kind of trying to figure out whether something went wrong with the rain gauges, because some of them up in the mountains seem to show that as much as 20 inches of rain fell in an hour. Rain on a scale that's just was impossible to imagine, except on a world where we've begun to change in profound ways the boundary conditions. Even just the simple fact of the heat has now gotten so high that in hot parts of the world, it's becoming almost impossible for people to just live. In big cities in Pakistan and Iraq over the last 14 months, we've seen the highest reliably recorded temperatures ever measured on our planet. In places like Basra, it got to 129 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, that's too hot for people to work, and too hot for people to sleep, and it basically is too hot for people to live for any real period of time. It's impossible for your body to shed that excess heat after a certain point, and so people just die. But that is the reality of the world in which we currently live. The reality of a world that we're just beginning, as Dr. Overpeck said, to sort of start waking up to, beginning to. The world made its first small, real, but small effort to do anything about this at Paris 2 years ago, and you all saw and were probably heartened to one degree or another by those climate accords. And I hope that many of you felt the same sense of shame and embarrassment that I felt watching our country decide, alone among nations, that it was not, in fact, going to live up to the promises that it had made at Paris, that it was going to renege on them, that the country that had put more carbon into the atmosphere over time than any other had decided that this was too much to ask. Since I'm an organizer by avocation now, I guess, I will say that there are a bunch of students here today who asked me if they could pass around petitions asking the university to join so many other places in making a pledge to hold on to those Paris Accords as best it can in its own policies and plans going forward. And I think that if you want to pass those around, now is the moment, I think. That pathway to Paris is an important thing that many people are signing on to. But it's by no means anywhere near enough. Even if we followed every single promise that everybody made at Paris, we would still be on a trajectory to increase the temperature of this Earth 3.5 degrees Celsius, 6 or 7 degrees Fahrenheit, in the lifetime of the youngest people in this room. And that would be enough to not just cause problems, but to threaten the ability to have civilizations like the ones that we have known. We are up against the biggest problem that we have ever faced. And we have to do something about it, and do something about it now. Okay? Okay, we're through the really hard part. You can take a breath, I will take a breath. And I'll actually tell you some good news for a minute, which is that we know more or less what we need to do about all this. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we didn't know really. We knew we had to get off fossil fuel, but what really to replace it with? In the last 10 years, the people who've really done their job are the engineers. They've done an amazing job of bringing down the price of renewable energy. The price of a solar panel has dropped 80%. It's continuing to plummet. Wind power is now the cheapest way to produce electrons all over the world. We could do this. We know we could do it because the few places that have really tried have done amazing things. Last year, Denmark generated half the power it used from the wind, which either means that the crafty Danes have figured out a way to corner the world's wind supply, or it means that they've taken the same resources available to all of us and put them to good use. I was in Africa, in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, and then over in East Africa and Tanzania for the New Yorker this spring, watching as places that had never had any power at all leapfrogged straight over the fossil fuel age and got the first electricity to their villages with solar panels on the roofs of huts. It was incredibly moving to watch. Incredibly moving to see people have the first glass of cold water that they'd ever had in villages on the equator, because all of a sudden, it was really almost a kind of miracle to just sit there and watch it. And when you really think about it, the fact that we've developed a plate of glass that you can point at the sun and at the other end of it turn it into light and cold and all the things that we need, that's That's a miracle that we could be taking advantage of. So, the question becomes why we haven't. We face the biggest problem we've ever faced. We have a set of solutions. Why are we not? Why are we still moving such incredible slowness? Why are we taking, at best, baby steps in the right direction? That's the really important question, and it's one that I screwed up on for a very long time. It took me 15 years, or 10 or 15 years after writing The End of Nature. I just kept writing more books and giving more talks and having more, because I'm a writer, okay? That's what I left to my own devices. You know, I'm an academic. I like to go to symposiums and things, you know? And the theory was that we were in an argument, and hence we had to keep arguing and produce more reports and papers and books, and eventually the people who were our leaders would take note of the fact that they were being warned of the greatest problem in the world, and they would do something about it. It took me a long time to figure out that I had misanalyzed this, that we were not in an argument, that we had won the argument long before, that by the mid-1990s, the scientific community was in strong, workable consensus about what problem we faced and what we needed to do. We'd won the argument, but we weren't really in an argument, we were in a fight. And the fight, as fights always are, was about money and about power, and the other side of the fight, the fossil fuel industry, was the richest force on the planet, and it was able to use that money and that power to prevail in that fight, despite having lost that argument. They were willing, are willing, to do whatever it takes to try to extend their business model another decade or two out in the future, even at the expense of wrecking the planet. If that sounds hyperbolic, I probably wouldn't have said it until 2 or 3 years ago, when great reporters at places like the Los Angeles Times and the Columbia Journalism School started reporting a just staggering series of exposés that made clear that from historical documents and interviews with whistleblowing scientists and things, that the biggest fossil fuel companies, Exxon, the biggest company period in the world for much of the last 50 years, had known everything there was to know about climate change in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And of course they did. They were hugely rich, they had great scientists, and their product was carbon. They made it their business to understand what was happening. And their scientists told them with great precision how much it was going to warm and how fast. They were spot on. And the company believed them. Exxon began building all its oil rigs to compensate for the sea level rise that it knew was coming. But what they didn't do was tell any of the rest of us. What they did instead was invest hundreds of millions of dollars in building the architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that has kept a completely pointless debate about whether or not global warming was real alive for 25 years. I mean, think about that. The debate's been going on for 25 years, but both sides of it, science and the oil industry, knew for the whole time what the answer was, okay? It was a pretend debate. But when you have that much money and that much power, then you can get inside people's heads. And look at the result. We have a president right now who apparently believes that climate change was a hoax manufactured by the Chinese, okay? That's incorrect. Unless somehow the Chinese had managed to enlist the ice caps in their conspiracy. Okay. So, If I sound a little bitter about all this, it's because had we spent that 25 years at work on this problem instead of debating its existence, we would be well on the way to having dealt with it at this point. And instead, we are now way behind the 8 ball, but there is no use mourning it at this point. The question becomes how to fight. When I started really to try or began to kind of figure out what was going on, I decided probably writing more books was not going to move the needle anymore. I continue to write books, but that's just momentum, you know. And mostly what I do now is try and build power to match the power of the fossil fuel industry. We knew that it wasn't going to be power that would come from money. We'd never have that kind of money. Instead, it was going to have to come from the other way that Americans and people around the world occasionally assemble power when they build the sort of movements that have stood up for human rights and civil rights and women's rights and the rights of gay people and on and on and on. So we set to work. When I say we in this case, the we I'm referring to in particular in my little corner of this when we started 350.org was myself and 7 college students at the little college in Vermont where I do some teaching. So, just like the students here, same SAT scores, same debt load, same everything else, okay? And we had no idea what we were doing. We took the name 350.org because it was the most important data point really on the planet. The greatest climatologist in the world, Jim Hansen at NASA, had just published a paper saying 350 parts per million CO2 is the most CO2 we could safely have in the atmosphere, a number, sadly, that we're already way north of. We passed 410 parts per million briefly sometime this spring. So it was an important number, but the reason we chose it was because our ludicrous plan was to organize globally to fight climate change. It's a good thing we weren't smart enough to realize how ludicrous it was. There were 7 continents, there were 7 undergraduates, each one took one. The one that took the Antarctic also had to take the internet, okay? And so off we went to do our work, and our work was to find other people like ourselves around the world. There's not everywhere something called an environmentalist, but there's everywhere someone worried about public health or hunger or war and peace or women's rights or all the things we're not going to have on a rapidly degrading planet. So they were our natural allies, and we just said to everybody, let's take a day and try to drive this new information into the kind of information bloodstream of the planet. Just pick a day. Here's the day we're going to choose and do something wherever you are. I'm a sometime Methodist Sunday school teacher. So this was our organizing tactic was basically large potluck supper, you know. Potluck supper being kind of the Methodist sacrament, you know, and we didn't know if it would work. No one had ever really tried anything like it, and we didn't have any resources or anything. We got the first sense it might work 2 days early. We told everybody to do this on a big Saturday in October, and on Thursday we were sitting around our little one-room office around our table. The 8 of us doing all the last-minute work, and the phone rang, and it was our leader in Ethiopia, who, like all of us, was a volunteer, like most of us was a she, like a surprising number of us was 17 years old, and she was in tears on the phone. She said, the government took away our permit for Saturday, so we're doing this today before they can stop us. That was brave. Ethiopia, not a necessarily very kind government to people who do things it says not to, but that wasn't why she was crying. She just kept saying, we wanted to do this the same day as everybody else. We want to be part of the whole thing all over the world. We want to be together with everybody. We don't want to spoil it. We're really, really sorry. And we have 15,000 kids right now out in the street in Addis Ababa chanting 350. So we were like, wow, don't worry about the date. It's good. And it was good. it was the beginning of this weekend that saw 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries around the world. CNN said it was the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history. So US troops in Afghanistan, but mostly just people from every corner of the world. I'm going to show you just the tiniest fraction of these pictures. I could do it all day and all night. One thing that got me, I mean, there were coming in 10 and 20 a minute sometimes from around the world that weekend. And one of the things that really blew me away, I'd spent my life hearing from people that environmentalism was something that rich white people did, and that if you didn't know where your next meal was coming from, you wouldn't be an environmentalist, and on and on and on. And it took half an hour of watching these to realize that that was nonsense. That almost everybody who was doing this work around the world was poor and black and brown and Asian and young, because that's what almost the whole world is composed of, it turns out. In fact, I've reflected since that it's at least plausible, that rich white people are more of the problem than the solution in this particular dilemma that we face. But at any rate, there was a great deal of wit and great involvement of religious communities for the first time. This was before Pope Francis got out in front and things. It was good to see. I'd been to the Middle East to do some organizing. Obviously a hard place to do things because there's a lot of military checkpoints and stuff in the way, but the Dead Sea is shrinking very rapidly as temperatures rise. People wanted to do something, so the Jordanians said, we'll do the 3 on our beach. The Palestinians said, we'll do a big 5 on our beach in Palestine. The Israelis it was a beautiful day, the way things should be. 300 demonstrations in China, not an easy place to do this. A couple of them got broken up by the police, but China, which has put up an extraordinary number of coal-fired power plants, is now starting to take them down, and they're putting up renewable energy on a scale like no one's ever seen before. China is a very interesting place for this work. Those are our brothers and sisters in the Maldives. That's the Student Government Association in the Maldives. They're holding their meeting in the lagoon to illustrate the existential problem that they face. Maldives has been there for 5,000 years of continuous human inhabitation. It's more or less paradise. It's all white sand beaches and coconut palms. But the highest point in this archipelago that spreads 1,000 miles across the equator, the highest point's about 5 feet above sea level. That's a bad place to be on a rapidly rising planet, but they're doing what they can. God bless them. And people everywhere in the toughest places in the world doing what they can. All the women in that picture in that zero, they're all in full black burqa. So to us, it doesn't look like the, Sierra Club holding their monthly chapter meeting, but basically their hearts are in exactly the same place. They're not thinking about themselves. They're thinking about the future and how to help. There were 300 or 400 pictures that ended up in a file marked 350 adorable. They were adorable, and they were also really hard to look at. Those girls with those big eyes are going to be refugees in their lifetime, more likely than not, and not because of anything they did, because of stuff we did. So we've kept doing all this stuff, and we think about 20,000 demonstrations all over the world, and we'd love to just keep doing this kind of stuff. It's all we'd do. If we had 50 years to solve this problem, this kind of educational work would be just what we'd most like to do. It's taken us to places we'd never heard of before and places we've heard of for other reasons, and it's been incredible fun. It's allowed us to do these giant art projects. There's 3,000 people making the image of King Canute trying to hold back the rising seas, We did all these huge art projects so big that we had to borrow a satellite to even get the pictures of them. That's people leaving through the roof of a house in the Dominican Republic, a sight we see all too often now on a flooding planet. That might have been my favorite. That's one of those arid, dried out riverbeds now in the drought-ridden Southwest. But when the satellite came over, 3,000 people just flipped up blue blankets and towels for a minute to kind of bring the river back to life. Like I say, if we had 50 years to do it, this is what we would do. Because that's how humans change best. Slowly, gradually, evolutionarily, one generation learns the truth, passes it on, we make some of the shifts, it doesn't cost so much, on we go. Our problem is that we had to start 25 years ago, and we didn't, and we're now so far behind that we have no choice, I think, but to supplement that education with a certain amount of confrontation. These are pictures from the start of the fight against the Keystone pipeline about 6 or 7 years ago. Well, we thought we had not the slightest chance of winning, and no one else did either. The National Journal, the trade paper in D.C., polled its energy insiders that August when we were starting, and 91% of them said TransCanada would have its permit for this thing by the end of 2011. But we thought, to fight it. Jim Hansen had just published a paper saying that the economically recoverable oil up there in the tar sands, if you burned it all, that alone would take the atmospheric concentration of CO2 from 400 parts per million to 540 parts per million, okay, just from that. So we decided to fight, and a lot of people showed up, and they went to jail. It was the biggest civil disobedience action in 30 years in this country about anything. And it was enough to kind of get it going and spreading around the planet and, back to DC. And what do you know? President Obama delayed it a couple of times and finally put the kibosh on it. Now Donald Trump wants to bring it back again, and we're in the middle of the fight again, and who knows how it'll prevail. But for going on 7 years now, we've kept 800,000 barrels a day of the dirtiest oil on earth underground, so that's good. More to the point, it seemed to convince everyone else that was watching that actually there was some point in taking on the oil industry, okay? That big fossil fuel was not necessarily unbeatable despite all their advantages, and so now everything like this gets fought at every turn. No one builds a fracking well or a pipeline or a coal port or anything else without a huge fight, and sometimes we win those fights. In fact, we win them more and more and more. This morning, this same company, TransCanada, announced that it had pulled out of plans for what would have been the biggest pipeline in the world, the Energy East pipeline heading to the Atlantic in Canada from the tar sands. They couldn't take the heat. Last week, we got news that the final last sixth of the 6 proposed huge coal ports for the west coast of the United States that would have taken the coal from the interior of the U.S. and shipped it to Asia, all 6 of them have now been beaten by fantastic organizing. Day before yesterday, Scotland became the 9th country to ban fracking within its borders. There are remarkable things starting to happen because people have risen up and fought. And some of them are happening right here in Michigan. It was really fun to see some of my friends from Traverse City a little while ago who've been leading this fight against the pipeline that runs under Mackinac Strait there, Line 5. And I remember the day when sort of a lot of the agitation about it was launched. There was a big rally on a hot, beautiful day up on the northern end of the bridge up there, and it seemed a long shot because no one's ever shut down an existing pipeline before, but these guys are going to be the first. You all are going to be the first to do it here in Michigan. Because it's crazy. It's a pipeline built in the early 1950s, and it goes under some of the most beautiful and precious water resource on the whole planet. I mean, you guys are guardians of the Great Lakes, and we need you to guard them for us, but they are a treasure for the planet. It's some huge percentage of the fresh water that exists on this earth. Okay? And the idea that they're endangered simply so a Canadian company can run some oil down from Canada, taking a shortcut through Michigan and then sending it back up into Ontario is insane. I had you sign a petition before. Now we're moving a little bit up the activist engagement ladder. Those of you who know how to text on your phones, you can join the effort to shut down that Line 5 pipeline by texting the word enforce, ENFORCE, to 231-480-4112. 231-480-4112. We're just getting started. You're going to be in more trouble than this before this is over. Think about that for a minute. Yesterday, GM announced that basically they understand they're going out of the internal combustion business, and before long, that they can see the day ahead when they will have built their last gasoline-powered car. Let's hope that day comes very soon, both for the planet and for GM, because they're going to get their lunch eaten if it doesn't by everybody else who's moving fast in that direction. We're moving out of that age. Don't let the last place to get ruined by the oil age be the Great Lakes. Shut down that pipeline now. It's a huge and beautiful opportunity. All around the world, we've asked people over the years to do these days where they just gather in places that have already felt the sting of climate change, just to illustrate. There's just drought everywhere. Some places the problem's a little less life-threatening than others, but for those of us who love the flow of the seasons, the fact that winter is beginning to disappear is a sadness. These are people up in Siberia. We now have forest fires 3, 4, 5 degrees of latitude north of where we've ever seen them before because it's so hot and dry. These are people who are leaving their homes in Micronesia because now their homes are wet all the time. That top red balloon is where the Dead Sea was 40 years ago. If it's not drought, it's flood. These are people in the part of Pakistan that had the biggest flood since Noah in 2010. It started raining up in the Khyber Pass, and it just did not stop. And by the time the water had flown down, the Indus River was covering a quarter of the country, and 20 million people were out of their homes. Okay? And if you look at them, you get the strong sense that they probably did not do much to cause the problem from which they are suffering. Okay? Climate change is the biggest, among other things, attack on justice and fairness that there's ever been. There's an almost perfect inverse relationship between how much of the problem you caused and how quickly and how hard you get pinched by it, all right? Again, I'm sad to say I could show you these pictures literally forever, and I won't. But I will show you that one, and I'll stop and look at it for a minute because it's meaningful to me in two ways. One, it is obviously just some kids in a street that's turning into a muddy river in a storm, but there are two things about it that are powerful to me. One is the sign that those kids are holding. Your actions affect me, which is true. The Caribbean as a whole this year is just being taken apart. We've saw more hurricane activity, what the scientists call accumulated cyclonic energy, in September of this year in the Atlantic than we've ever seen in any month since record-keeping started in 1851. There are islands like Barbuda that, for the first time in hundreds of years, no longer have any inhabitants on them because there's no place left to live. Okay? Your actions affect me, but not vice versa. There's nothing that anyone in Haiti can do to solve this problem. They can't use less fossil fuel because they don't use any fossil fuel now. They can't come to Washington and protest outside the world's sole superpower because we don't let people from Haiti come to the United States and wander around, you know. They can't divest their holdings in oil company stock because I would guess that the $10 or $12 billion that the University of Michigan has in its endowment far exceeds the total investment capital in all of Haiti. Okay? And it's time for the University of Michigan to join others in getting rid of that stock. Not only because it's a big help in this fight, and it would join now about $6 trillion worth of endowments and portfolios around the world that have done so, including, I will say, I was very happy to see yesterday on St. Francis's feast day that 40 big Catholic institutions joined in, including the Diocese of Assisi in Italy, which made me very, very happy. Not only would it have strong practical effect, but it also at this point is the only moral course of action to take. The kind of things that I described that Exxon was doing about lying about climate change, those are the things that would get you kicked out of this university if you did them with the research you were conducting, okay? And it is not okay to be engaged with that sort of thing. And that's why it's good, and I promise you I'm getting really near the end here. That's why it's good that everybody's fighting now, fighting hard all the time against everything they can think of. And it's beautiful to see how big and diverse it's becoming. One of the most beautiful things is that indigenous people around the world, including on this continent, have emerged at the absolute forefront of this fight in the last few years. And that's extraordinarily powerful. I don't know, this week last year, I was at Standing Rock in North Dakota in that wonderful encampment there to try and stop the pipeline in the Dakotas, which we came very close to stopping until Mr. Trump's election. It's an important moment when the oldest wisdom traditions on this planet are meshing precisely with the newest wisdom traditions, when the vision that's coming out of the sweat lodge matches up with the vision that's coming out of the supercomputer, okay? That's an important and powerful moment in human history that might allow us some real change. So now people are gathering everywhere in increasingly large numbers, not 5, 10, 50, 100 at a time, but this was from the march in New York City a couple of years ago with 400,000 people on the move until the Women's March last January, the biggest demonstrations in the US in a very, very long time. And it's wonderful to see this happening and see it happening all over the world. Let me end just with a couple of pictures from that same period, because they make a point that I want to just drive home. These are from the Pacific, from those low-lying island nations that may not be there in 100 years. Vanuatu, Tuvalu, the Marshalls, Micronesia, the Solomons. But their slogan is, we're not drowning, we're fighting. And they are. On each of those islands, they cut down a tree and they built a big old war canoe. And they took them, that same day we were all in New York, they took them to Newcastle in Australia, which is the largest coal port on the planet. And they used them there to blockade in for a day the biggest ore ships on Earth and keep them from coming out into the harbor. And it was beautiful to watch, and beautiful in part because it reinforced that oldest of human tropes, this battle of the many and the small against the big and the few. And that's really the battle we're engaged in, whether we can move with the speed we need to overcome the incredible power of a very few but very wealthy and important human beings. That's the other picture that makes the same point. It's from a year later in the harbor in Seattle, and I could show you the same pictures from Portland. This was when Shell Oil decided that it wanted to drill for oil in the Arctic, the melting Arctic. Think about that for a minute. Climate scientists had explained that if we kept burning coal and gas and oil, we would heat the planet enough that the Arctic would melt. Then the Arctic melted. Did Shell Oil look at that and say, maybe we should stop burning so much oil and start building solar panels? No, they looked at that and said, now that it's melted in the Arctic, it'll be easier to drill for more oil there. Okay? If you were in search of an argument that the big brain may not have been a great adaptation, you could hardly do better than that. But happily, there are a lot of people with good brains and big hearts attached to them that tried to stand in the way. They took to small craft in those waters to get in the way of those giant rigs. We called them kayaktivists. And what do you know, they won. Shell couldn't sustain the brand damage that they were taking. And by the end of the season, they said, forget it. We're out of the business of drilling in the Arctic. Thank you very much. So all I'm trying to tell you is the planet is way outside its comfort zone. So you need to be outside your comfort zone some too, okay? This is the challenge of our time. The challenge, every time has a challenge. For our parents or grandparents' time, they had to go off to Europe to fight fascism. And, a huge number of them got killed. We don't have to make that kind of sacrifice, but we have to up our game considerably because we are losing the planet on our watch. Planet's outside its comfort zone, so we need to be too. I was looking at those pictures. I hadn't seen them for a little while, and I was looking at them and thinking about those arrests in Washington at the start of the Keystone thing. I was the one who wrote the letter that asked people to come get arrested, which is a hard letter to write. Looking around the diversity of age in this audience, let me say that one of the things I said in that letter that was important to me was that I did not think that young people should have to be the cannon fodder for this particular part of the fight. As you can see from these pictures, they're doing most of the leading all over the world, all over the world, young people doing their thing. But if you're 22 right now, maybe not the best thing for your resume to have an arrest record, right at the top of it. One of the few unmixed blessings of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you? And so it was with some pleasure that we watched lots of people with hairlines like mine arrive in DC. We didn't say, how old are you? Because that would be rude, but we did cleverly, I think, say, who was president when you were born? And the two biggest cohorts were from the FDR and the Truman administrations. On the last day, there was a guy arrested with a sign around his neck that said, World War II vet, handle with care. He'd been born in the Warren Harding administration, which was so long ago, I'd forgotten there was a Warren Harding administration, okay? It was good. It was good for young people to see their elders acting the way elders need to act in a working civilization. Okay, and I will just add here, since we're in a university, those arguments about risk. If you have tenure, then these go triple for you. You're bulletproof, so you might as well do something with it, I'm not saying that you need to get arrested, though you might. I've had a lot of people come up to me and say, it's on my bucket list now. I'm really glad. But you do need to do something more than what you've been doing. We've moved up the ladder from petitions to texting to now you figure out what it's going to be. When we told people to come, asked people to come get arrested, the other thing we told them was, we need you to wear a dress or a necktie when you come. Okay. Now, I'm wearing a necktie today because I'm, out in company and you're all polite to ask me and things. I almost never wear, in Vermont, where I come from, we have, I think it's in the state constitution that you don't have to wear one. We don't do it. But we wanted to do it then because we wanted to make a visual point that is the point I've been making all along here, which is there is nothing radical about what we're talking about, nothing at all. All we're asking for is a world that's a little bit like the one we were born onto, with a little bit of ice at the top and the bottom, the odd coral reef someplace in the tropics. That's not a radical demand. If you think about it, that's a deeply conservative demand, okay? If you further think about it, radicals work at oil companies. If you get up in the morning to make your fortune by altering the chemical composition of the atmosphere, if you do it after scientists have told you what will eventuate, if you then see that happen, what the scientists told you would happen, and you continue anyway, then you are radical on a scale we have not observed on this planet before, and it is our job to figure out how to check that radicalism. I'll just end by saying, and if I were a good organizer, I'd just end there, but I'm in the end a writer, so my job is to be honest, frank above all else, and I'll end the way I started. It's not certain that even if we do everything right at this point, it's all going to come out okay. In fact, it's not all going to come out okay. Stopping climate change is no longer on the menu. At best, we're playing for keeping things from getting so out of control that we can't have sort of human civilizations like the ones we're accustomed to. And even that, at this point, is an open question. It is not a good sign that the largest physical features on this planet are already in significant flux, that the ice is melting fast, but the best science, as Dr. Peck said, indicates that we have at least some kind of window open, albeit a narrow one that's closing fast. And given the stakes, if we can alter the odds even somewhat, it seems well worth people's engagement, their serious engagement in this fight. So I want to thank everybody here who's already in this fight, the students who are doing a big rally tomorrow at 5 p.m. at Say again? The Union. Okay, 5 p.m. rally to call for keeping the Paris Accords. The people from Traverse City and throughout Michigan who are working hard to block that Line 5 pipeline. All you, so many thanks. And the rest of you, thanks in advance for being engaged going forward. I don't know if we're going to win, but I can absolutely guarantee you, and with some credibility now because I've shown you the pictures, that there is going to be a fight, that people all over the world are engaged in this fight, that while we're meeting here today, there are people meeting in 1,000 other places having this same conversation. It's been the great privilege of my life to get to sort of stand with them, and the great privilege to stand with you all shoulder to shoulder going forward. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you very much. And you very much. Please. Now, I've rattled on for a long time, and no moral opprobrium will attach to you should you decide to depart at this point. But I think, Dr. Killian, that we've left enough time for a few questions anyway.
Definitely. Thank you so much. I will say I was a recent chair of our promotion and tenure committee. And maybe we're talking about, the dean is actually talking about our criteria for tenure and our balance of research, teaching, education.
And criminal activity.
Impact. Yes. So maybe we need to make a criteria, add a criteria of civil disobedience,
There you
go
are.
to jail. That will help you with your tenure review and promotion. But anyway, we'd like to invite you to line up, queue up for questions. And on this side, we'd like to have students, okay? And then on the other side, others, faculty, community members. So we'll start with the student side. We have students. Usually students are eager to ask questions. Well, maybe we're going to start on the non-student side.
Thank you for coming and speaking so eloquently to us about the things that the people of the world can do on this important problem. Many people feel that the most important single action that could be taken would be to get our governments to implement a price on carbon, especially if that's done in the form of a carbon fee, and especially if the proceeds from that are distributed back to the people. I'm wondering how you feel about that, whether you would endorse that action, and whether there's any chance that 350.org would come together to support such an action.
Yeah, no, we've worked hard on it for a very long time, and the people who've taken the lead on this is probably most importantly a group called the Citizens Climate Lobby that you might want to check out and investigate. But I've worked with them from the beginning, and I've spent 30 years explaining that there's no intellectual defense for not having a price on carbon. It's the only thing we're allowed to throw out for free, you know. I was saying to someone earlier today, it would be as if you ran a restaurant here in the center of Ann Arbor, and every night at the close of business, you just took all the garbage from the day and tossed it out in the middle of the street. Now, that would be the cheapest way to deal with it if you were the restaurant, but pretty soon you'd have rats in the street and leptospirosis, and civilizations don't do that, you know. People clean up after themselves except for the fossil fuel industry, which is allowed to spew carbon for free, use the atmosphere as an open sewer. There's no defense for that. And I'm glad that people are working on carbon pricing all over the place, and I think that that fee and dividend model that you talk about, and that my old friend Jim Hansen has talked about a lot, is probably the best way to go at it. That said, let me add, and this is one of these bad places where I have to resist, having written the first book about all this and worked on it for 30 years, I have to resist the temptation to say, if only you'd listened to me then, you know? Because 30 years ago, a modest price on carbon would have been enough to set us on a different trajectory, and we would have ended up in a different place. That's no longer the case. We've now so far behind the 8 ball that we're going to have to do many things at the same time. A price on carbon is one of them, but if in order to get it, we had to bargain away the other tools that we need, strong regulatory attack on the fossil fuel industry, support for the subsidies that would drive very rapid implementation of renewables and things, that would be a bad bargain. So we need to be able to do all these things at once. And that's sort of, I think, the sine qua non at this point for action. Thank you very much. Your turn.
Well, first of all, sir, I wanted to thank you for addressing the Line 5 pipeline. I think that's a huge issue, and I really urge everyone here, if they haven't already, to take action on that issue. I guess my question involves consumption. Of course, moving to renewable energy and preventing new pipelines and whatnot are hugely important. But I think, consumption obviously is playing a huge role in this. We have plastic water bottles, and our clothes are made of polyester, and all of these issues. And I mean, how can we kind of collectively address the issue of consumption?
Thank you very much for asking that question. And it's something really my fault for not figuring out how to address. I should have talked about it more. So here's the thing. For a long time, environmentalists concentrated a lot on consumption. There was a lot of talk about which light bulb, which car, whatever. And that's not errant or idle talk. I mean, my house is covered with solar panels. I drove the first electric Ford in the state of Vermont. Some years we've managed to feed our whole family just with food from our little valley. These are all sweet things that I like and endorse and people should do. And I try hard not to fool myself that it's really the way that we're going to deal with climate change. We're so far behind the 8 ball now, we're so far behind that mathematically, the only way we can deal with this is to have people come together in sufficient numbers to force changes in policy that have big, broad, rapid, sweeping effects on society. So the good news is it doesn't take everybody to do that. I mean, getting everybody to change the clothes they wear or to use your examples or things is very, very hard work, okay? And probably too slow in that form to have much effect on the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. But 3, 4, 5% of people deeply engaged in a fight like this is enough to change the politics of it and win and force big changes in policy. So that's, I mean, think about the way that people who fought for gay marriage managed to change the zeitgeist in the course of a few years to the point where something that for those of us who are older here seemed almost impossible to imagine even 5 or 10 years ago now seems as normal and obvious as it could possibly be. That's the reason that we do build movements, engage in activism. And I think at this point, if we had 50 years, the right solution would be one household at a time, one person at a time, those kind of changes. And you should definitely make those changes in your life. But if you have a given quanta of time and energy and focus and things, the first thing to do is to organize, to join together. The most important thing an individual can do is not be such an individual for a little while and come together with other people in this fight. So I'm so glad you're doing that around line 5, and I'm glad you're conscientious about everything else too. Thank you very much.
So I'm an educator, but I fancy myself a problem solver. And this is a new problem to me, although I don't think about it every day. I do when I bring out my own garbage. And it occurred to me as a young student was talking that maybe we have an opportunity here that Mother Nature has provided. In many of the islands that were hit by the hurricane, Puerto Rico is one of the things I'm thinking of because my husband's family is from there. It was dawning on me that in a room full of academics, some who might have the wealth and power to actually affect change right now, we could rebuild Puerto Rico as our social experiment, because it needs to be done either way, and rebuild them entirely off the grid.
So this is exactly right. I had a phone call from my good friend and neighbor in Vermont, Mr. Sanders, on Wednesday saying, I need you to get together all people who can tell me about energy policy, because I think we got to rebuild Puerto Rico with solar panels, which clearly we should. I mean, it's crazy to just go set up the pins again in the bowling alley, and knock them over. And Puerto Rico makes entire sense for solar energy. Anybody who's ever looked at it just takes 2 minutes to so that it pencils out. It's incredibly sunny. This would be an easy place to put cheap solar technology to work, especially since everybody's paying 20 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity because their electricity comes from diesel that has to arrive by boat. The reason that it's going to be difficult is mostly because Puerto Rico is in such debt to Wall Street that it's very hard for people to get the financing that they need to build solar power, right? The solar power pencils out perfectly, but somebody has to be willing to put those in and hope to get repaid for it. At the moment, since you have to write a check in advance for the boat with the diesel to come, that's what happens, all right? So clearing away those thickets is going to be really important. People are starting to work on it. There's a lot of short-term solar relief going in there, kind of airdropping in solar panels and Tesla Powerwall batteries and things, which is a very good idea. And you're absolutely right, and it'll be a good test to see whether we're capable in Washington of cutting through the nonsense, telling Wall Street they're going to have to take a serious haircut on their debt because there are people dying in Puerto Rico, and doing the right thing, or whether we're just blindly going to go ahead and, I mean, think of the folly it would represent to just rebuild Puerto Rico's existing electric grid again. That would be almost as dumb as drilling for oil in the melting Arctic. So thank you.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you very much for your talk, first of all. So my question kind of relates to a club I'm in here called the Students for Clean Energy. And last time I checked, the United States uses about 15% clean energy, according to the EIA, but U of M only uses about 2% clean energy due to the natural gas plant that we have on campus. And so with the Students for Clean Energy, we found that the university is mostly resistant to renewable energy on campus, mainly for cost reasons, as these higher costs would be passed on to students like us through increased tuition. So my question is, how do we advocate for clean energy when even the most liberal and educated of institutions respond with concerns about cost alone?
Well, the first thing to be said is, and I think it's really important just to say it because it's one of these things that seems like a minor point, but it's actually really crucial. I'm glad that everybody's come to understand that natural gas is not clean energy. That between the carbon emissions from burning it and the methane emissions from leaking when you frack it and put it in a pipeline, it's probably worse than burning coal to burn natural gas, certainly no better. And so it's really imperative to get off fossil fuel and onto renewable energy. I don't know I haven't looked at all the cost structure here in Michigan for energy, but there's no reason that we can't figure out how to do renewable energy at scale in Michigan. This is a place look, Germany has demonstrated, there are now days that Germany generates all the electricity it uses from solar panels. On a particularly sunny day, that's what happens, okay? No one ever went to Germany for a beach vacation in their life, okay? Michigan can do this too. I've been blown around in the winter wind in Michigan from time to time, There's plenty of resource here to do it. And more to the point, there's plenty of engineering talent right here at the university to make it happen. How silly in a place that would pride itself on leadership in technology to say, well, we're going to go with what's essentially 18th century technology. We're going to dig stuff up and burn it. When all the interest, all the future, all the jobs that we need to be preparing people for, all the excitement, all the whatever, lies in holding up that almost magic glass plate to the sun and churning out electrons, in taking that windmill and converting the breeze that washes across the upper Midwest into power that we can use. It's not easy. It'll take some financing. It'll take some whatever. None of this should be construed as easy. It isn't easy, but it's the task of our time. And if universities aren't going to engage in that task, I think it's fair to ask who is going to. Thank you, and thank you for your work. Do we have time for? I don't want to.
About 40 years ago, I was somewhat involved in the ozone wars, and it was very interesting. That was the chemical industry poured millions of dollars. It's the same thing, it's only a theory, let's wait, and all of that. But interestingly enough, it didn't become a political issue, it was just money. And a few years later, Dow Chemical and DuPont realized they can make just as money, with alternate refrigerants and so on.
Yep.
So the Montreal Protocol came about and so on. Now, Exxon or Shell would have to go to solar energy or wind energy to have the same result. But maybe the solar panel industry or the wind industry can enter the fray, and something like that could happen.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you for your work around ozone stuff. Finally now, it's 25 years after the Montreal Protocol, we're beginning to see the ozone layer actually start to heal itself. And had people not done that work back when you were doing it, we would be in a deep spot of trouble now, so thank you. And you pinpoint the difference between the two cases. The chlorofluorocarbons that were eroding the ozone layer were a relatively minor part of our industrial economy and easily replaced by something else. And so Dow and DuPont, after 10 years of fighting, gave in and started making just as much money doing the next thing. When we talked about this when I was talking with students this afternoon, it's a really important question to understand why, say, Exxon, which knew everything about climate change, remember 35 years ago, didn't decide to just own the solar energy industry. They could have taken their vast cash flow and dominated the renewable industry. And the reason they didn't is because though they could have made a lot of money doing that, they could not make as much money as they have with hydrocarbons. And the reason is, if you think about it, the flaw in the business plan as far as Exxon or Shell or anyone's concerned with solar energy is, once you put the panel on the roof, the sun comes for free. Okay? And from their point of view, that's the dumbest business model that anyone ever came up with. Okay? And that's why they've worked so hard to keep it from happening. That's why virtually every utility in America still works to make it difficult and expensive for its customers to connect to solar energy. That's why this is such a battle all the time. That's why we're here. Thank you. Do we have time for one more? One last question.
Thank you. This isn't a question, so I'm going to let my friend go after me, but I'm just here to say that if you have a clipboard with the petitions on it, there will be students wearing gray t-shirts with May's flaming planets on them outside by the doors, ready to collect them.
Good organizing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for
Let's do one last question then, and thank you.
Hi, Bill. Thanks again for taking the time to answer the questions now and earlier. This is talking more about sequestration, and I understand, I'm learning to understand how we are well over the parts per million that is recommended, and how moving forward, not only do we have to divest in fossil fuels, but also taking that carbon out, and how that is going to be a major role in moving forward.
Yep, you gotta, first job one is turn off the faucet that's pouring the stuff into the tub. And if we don't do that, then all the rest is useless. We've got to stop using fossil fuels. But you're right, we've already got too much carbon in the atmosphere. Job two is widen the drain at the bottom so that more flows out. Oceans and forests remove carbon from the atmosphere already. Those are the sinks that we very much need to keep operating, and we're beginning to threaten them by raising the temperature. There are also things we could do, especially with the ways that we farm and otherwise use soils, that would probably allow soils to sequester more carbon than they do at the moment, and that would be helpful too. Not going to be a cure-all, but it would be a positive step to be taking. So soil is, if there are budding soil scientists here or things, keep at it. It's one of the next real places of great interest going forward. Let me just say, what a privilege to get to be here. Many thanks for having me. And I I gave you all a hard time and pushed fairly hard, and I apologize in a sense for that. My sense of urgency grows all the time, and so I just get ruder and blunter the older I get. And if you come back and see me in 10 years, I'll just be gibbering, you know. So it's good that you got to me now, and many, many thanks for all that you do.